The scent of death already hovered through the shadowy corridors of Plessis-les-Tours Castle when Louis XV awoke for the last time in August 1483. His glassy eyes fixed on the vaulted ceiling as a guttural moan escaped from his ulcerated throat. The sound echoed across the damp stones like the lament of a condemned spirit, and the few servants who dared remain in the castle crossed themselves in silence, whispering hurried prayers. The Spider King, as he was known by subjects who both feared and loathed him in equal measure, now lay ensnared in his web of agony, each thread woven with the blood of conspiracies, betrayals, and vengeance that he had orchestrated during his 22 years on the throne. But the power that once emanated from his shrewd, blade-like eyes had transformed into pure terror, terror of God, terror of death, terror of what he had become. A few years earlier, Louis XV had reigned as the most feared monarch in Europe, his influence spreading like invisible tentacles through a network of spies, informants, and deadly alliances that made even the most powerful nobles tremble at the mere mention of his name. In the halls of power, his name was muttered in hushed tones, accompanied by furtive glances and trembling genuflections. He had shattered the backbone of the French feudal aristocracy, reducing proud counts to beggars and elevating cunning merchants to positions of prominence through a political alchemy that blended calculated cruelty with diabolical intelligence. His hands, always adorned with heavy rings laden with symbolism and authority, moved over maps and documents like those of a maestro conducting a deadly symphony, each gesture determining the fate of thousands. Plessis-les-Tours Castle, his personal fortress, was then a labyrinth of lavish chambers where ambassadors knelt to the floor, where treaties were signed in ink still redolent of the blood of the vanquished, and where every wall bore witness to the birth of stratagems that would redefine France's political map. In those days of dark glory, Louis XV strode through the halls with resolute steps echoing like royal decrees across polished marble, his slender figure cloaked in garments of precious fabrics that whispered with every movement, proclaiming his superiority over all mortals. His face, angular and marked by nearly imperceptible scars, reminders of survived assassination attempts, radiated a cold intelligence that made fully grown men feel like frightened children in the presence of a cruel deity. When he smiled, which was rare, it was as though the devil himself revealed his teeth. And when he furrowed his brow, political storms gathered on the horizon. He had built his reputation on mountains of political corpses, each decision calculated to maximize his absolute power over France and beyond its borders. He was a man who slept little, ate even less, and devoted every waking moment to the art of human manipulation, an art he mastered as no other mortal of his time. But time, that relentless executioner who respects neither crown nor scepter, began to spin its own web around the Spider King. The first signs of deterioration appeared subtly, like shadows lengthening imperceptibly at dusk. His hands, once as steady as iron when signing death sentences or decrees that altered the destinies of entire provinces, began to tremble almost unseen during morning audiences. At first, only his personal physician, an anxious, pallid man named Jacques Coitier, noted these tremors, but the doctor dared only record his observations in secret codes within his medical parchments, fearing that any mention of royal frailty could result in his own summary execution. The king, perceiving the changes in his body with the same acuity with which he detected conspiracies in the corridors of power, initially attributed the symptoms to the stress of military campaigns and the sleepless nights spent plotting his enemy's downfall. The first truly alarming episode occurred during an audience with the Venetian ambassador in the autumn of 1481. Louis XV, in the midst of a particularly complex negotiation regarding Mediterranean trade rights, was suddenly overcome by such intense vertigo that he had to discreetly lean on the arm of his gilded throne. The ambassador, a seasoned diplomat accustomed to reading royal countenances, noticed the sudden pallor that washed over the monarch's face, a pallor that contrasted starkly with the flushed cheeks he normally wore when focused on state affairs. For a moment that seemed eternal, silence reigned in the audience hall, broken only by the crackling of the flames in the hearth and the king's heavy, irregular breathing. The following months brought a cascade of symptoms that the royal physician recorded with mounting concern in his secret journals. His Majesty experiences frequent episodes of vertigo, accompanied by headaches that cause him to groan during the stillest hours of the night, Poitiers wrote in obscure Latin, using deliberately illegible handwriting to protect both his observations and his own life. His hands tremble not only during exertion, but also at rest, and I have observed that his eyes, once as piercing as blades, now exhibit moments of blur and confusion that His Majesty attempts to mask with frequent blinking and abrupt head movements. The doctor also noted, with growing alarm, that the king had begun talking to himself during his walks through the castle gardens, engaging in seemingly intense conversations with invisible interlocutors, gesturing with trembling hands as though negotiating treaties with ghosts. The physical transformation was but the tip of the iceberg of a far deeper and more terrifying deterioration. Louis XVI, who had always been a man of moderate but disciplined appetite, began displaying erratic eating behaviors, alternating between prolonged fasting and episodes of ravenous gluttony that left him nauseated and shaking. During a banquet, held in honor of the Flemish ambassadors, witnesses reported that the king devoured an impressive quantity of venison, bread, and wine, only to violently vomit it all in the castle gardens before horrified guests who pretended not to see, fearing for their own safety. The sound of his retching echoed through the night like the cry of a wounded animal, and the next morning the royal rosebeds were found stained with remnants of the king's meal. A grim metaphor for the state of the kingdom itself. But it was during the harsh winter of 1482 that the true nature of the royal illness revealed itself in all its horrifying magnitude. Louis VIII awoke one particularly cold night, feeling as though an invisible vice was crushing his head, a pain so intense it made him scream with a force that roused every inhabitant of the castle. The guards, initially believing the king was under attack, burst into his chambers only to find him writhing on his royal bed, his hands pressing against his temples with such force that the veins on his wrists bulged like taut ropes under his pale skin. His breathing had become a haunted sound, a mixture of groans and whispers barely human, and his eyes that once hypnotized subjects and enemies alike with their calculating gleam, now rolled wildly in their sockets like those of a man possessed. That terrible night, for the first time in decades, Louis XV called for a priest, not the royal chaplain, whose formulaic prayers he had always tolerated with aristocratic impatience, but a humble Franciscan friar who lived on the outskirts of the castle, known for his simplicity and spiritual sincerity. When the friar arrived, he found the king kneeling on the cold stone floor of his chambers, clad only in a linen nightshirt that revealed a body dramatically emaciated over the previous weeks. "Father," Louis XVIII whispered in a voice scarcely recognizable as his own, I must confess before it's too late." The friar, initially intimidated by the royal presence, soon realized he faced not a powerful monarch, but a man desperate and terrified, a man who had finally understood that all his earthly power was insignificant before the approach of death. The confession lasted hours, stretching through the night like a river of remorse and terror. The king spoke of executions ordered in moments of rage, of entire families destroyed by his political paranoia, of broken alliances and betrayed promises in the name of raison d'etat. His voice, which once commanded armies and made nations tremble, was now only a broken whisper, frequently interrupted by bouts of coughing that left bloodstains on the silk handkerchief pressed against his lips. "How many men died at my will?" he asked the friar, though the question seemed addressed more to the void of the night than to the kneeling priest beside him. "How many widows weep because I craved more power? How many orphans curse my name in the streets of Paris?" The friar attempted to offer spiritual consolation, but Louis XV cut him off with a brusque gesture of his trembling hand. "Do not console me, Father. The truth is, I always knew what I was doing, and now God comes to claim his due." From that nocturnal confession onward, the king's decline accelerated dramatically, as though admitting his sins had broken the last barrier, keeping him functional as a minimally sane human being. His chambers, once organized with the military precision that characterized every aspect of his life, became a chaos of scattered parchments, soiled garments abandoned in dark corners, and half-eaten plates left on precious furniture where they attracted flies and exuded putrid odors. The stench emanating from his rooms became so unbearable that the servants refused to enter, and only Jacques Coitier and 2 other loyal attendants, driven more by terror than devotion, continued to attend to his basic needs. The royal physician, in his ever more desperate notes, recorded that Louis XV had developed a morbid fixation on sacred relics and amulets, filling his chambers with bones of saints, shards of wood supposedly from Christ's cross, and vials of water from rivers deemed holy. "His Majesty believes these objects may delay his death," Coitier wrote, "but I observe that his agitation increases in their presence, as though they bring him more terror than comfort." The king had begun speaking obsessively of demons. He claimed to see in the corners of his chambers shadows that moved independently of any light source, and voices that whispered his name during the darkest hours of the night. When asked about these visions, his eyes filled with genuine tears of terror, and he would murmur, "They have come for me. All those I ordered killed, they are here, waiting." During the final months of his life, Louis XV developed an obsessive routine that revealed the depths of his mental disintegration. Every morning, he would rise before dawn and spend hours kneeling before a dark wooden crucifix, repeating prayers he had learned in childhood, prayers he had ignored for decades in favor of the games of political power. His words emerged as incomprehensible laments, a mixture of ecclesiastical Latin, Old French, and guttural sounds that seemed to issue directly from his tormented subconscious. The few servants who still dared approach his chambers reported that during these moments of prayer, the king often cried out names of people he had executed, names of enemies he had destroyed, names of allies he had betrayed. "Charles of Burgundy," he would shout, referring to the duke who had died in battle against his forces. "Forgive me, forgive me." Then collapse into sobs that convulsed his entire body. Paranoia, which had always been a political tool deftly wielded in his hands, transformed into a destructive force that consumed his remaining sanity. Louis XV began seeing conspiracies in every shadow, assassins in every unexpected movement, poison in every meal served to him. He successively dismissed all his cooks, accusing them of attempted poisoning, and eventually prepared his meals himself. Meals consisting almost exclusively of dry bread and water, consumed in minuscule amounts, that barely sustained his increasingly frail body. His fingers, once nimble in signing state documents, now shook uncontrollably when he tried to hold a cup of water, spilling it over his garments and creating stains he interpreted as mystical signs of his imminent condemnation. Louis XV's terror intensified when he began having visions of his own death, visions so vivid he described them to Jacques Coitier with horrifying precision. "I see a dark room," he would murmur during a medical consultation, his eyes fixed on an invisible point beyond the stone wall. "A room where light cannot enter, and there is a hooded figure approaching my bed, carrying something in its hands. I cannot see what it is, but I know it is for me. It is what I deserve. The doctor, increasingly desperate to find any physical or mental cure for the king's suffering, began administering herbal concoctions that promised to calm the mind, but only seemed to intensify the monarch's nighttime terrors and hallucinations. It was during one of these nights of torment that Louis the Fiend experienced what witnesses would later describe as the most terrifying moment of his final descent. Around midnight, inhuman screams echoed through the castle corridors, screams so intense and prolonged that several servants fled their quarters, convinced demons had invaded Plessis-les-Tours. When Jacques Coitier and two brave guards reached the royal chambers, they found Louis the Fiend standing on his bed, completely nude, clawing at his own chest until bloody marks marred his pale flesh. He screamed toward the ceiling as though responding to accusations from some invisible celestial court. I was king, I had the right, God gave me power to decide life and death. But his words dissolved into sobs as he repeated in a desperate mantra, "But they will not forgive me, they will never forgive me." From that night onward, Louis the Fiend lost all sense of external reality, living in a dimension of terror that existed only in his fractured mind. He began regularly conversing with people long dead, engaging in intense political discussions with dukes he had ordered executed, negotiating imaginary treaties with kings who had perished in battles he himself had orchestrated. During these conversations, his personality oscillated drastically. One moment he was the imperious monarch demanding obedience. The next, he was a broken man begging for forgiveness. Then, a frightened child crying for his mother. Witnesses later reported that on certain occasions, he seemed literally to see these spectral figures, pointing to specific corners of his room and describing their garments and expressions in impossible detail. The king's physical appearance had deteriorated to the point of near unrecognizability. His hair, once carefully groomed and perfumed, now hung in greasy, matted clumps that he compulsively tugged at during anxiety fits, leaving bald patches on his scalp. His skin had taken on a waxy yellowish tone that made him resemble a corpse rather than a living man, and his eyes, sunken in dark circles from sleepless nights, shone with a feverish intensity that sent chills down anyone's spine. He had lost so much weight that his royal garments looked like poorly fitted shrouds on a skeleton, and when he attempted to walk, his movements were awkward and tremulous, akin to those of a much older man battling progressive paralysis. Jacques Coitier, in his final notes before the king's death, wrote with increasingly shaky handwriting, "I no longer recognize the man who once ruled France with an iron fist. What I see before me is a human ruin, a ghost of power haunting the very chambers where he once commanded the destinies of millions. His words have lost all coherence, his actions any purpose beyond the pure instinct to survive. He has not eaten in 3 days, refusing any food we offer, convinced each morsel of bread contains poison sent by his dead enemies. When I force him to drink water, he screams that the liquid burns his throat like acid, though I myself have tasted it to prove its innocence. I fear death is now not only inevitable, but a mercy both for him and for all of us who witness his agony." During his final weeks, Louis the Fiend developed a macabre routine that revealed the total depth of his mental collapse. Each night, he would drag himself to a particular window of his chambers, a window overlooking the cemetery of the castle chapel, and remain there for hours, whispering names to the tombstones visible by moonlight. He had convinced himself that the dead buried there were people he had ordered executed, though the cemetery held only local servants and craftsmen who had died of natural causes over the years. "Come," he murmured to the shadows among the gravestones, "come for me. I am waiting." I have always been waiting." His voice, once capable of silencing entire courts with its authority, was now only a ghostly whisper mingling with the night breeze. The physician recorded that during these moments at the window, Louis XV often tried to throw himself into the abyss, prevented only by iron bars installed years earlier as a security measure against potential assassins. He clings to the bars with a strength he should not possess in his debilitated state, Quartier wrote, and yells to the cemetery, "I am coming, I am coming," as though answering a call only he can hear. When we attempt to pull him away from the window, he looks at us with an expression of pure terror and whispers, "They are calling me. I cannot make them wait any longer, not after all I have done." The doctor also noted that during these episodes, the king seemed literally to age before his eyes, his features contorting and his posture bending, as though decades of guilt were physically manifesting in his body. The final unraveling of Louis XV was witnessed by only 3 people: Jacques Quartier, a servant named Pierre Doriol, and the Franciscan friar who had become his regular confessor. In the early hours of August 30th, 1483, the 3 men were awakened by a sound they later described as not entirely human, a mixture of moan, scream, and supplication that echoed through the stone corridors like the lament of a condemned soul. When they arrived at the royal chambers, they found Louis XV collapsed on the floor, writhing in a pool of his own bodily fluids, his eyes rolling uncontrollably as his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Most terrifying of all was that he continued trying to speak, uttering inarticulate sounds that occasionally crystallized into recognizable words. Forgiveness, demons, blood, crown. The friar, summoning his courage, knelt beside the dying king and began reciting the last rites. But his words were interrupted when Louis XVIII suddenly seized his hand with surprising strength and pulled the friar close to his face. His eyes, for a moment, regained a terrible clarity, and he whispered with an intensity that made the friar tremble, "They are here, all of them. Charles, Louis of Luxembourg, John of Bourbon, all those I destroyed. They have come for me, and I deserve what is about to happen." His words were followed by a smile devoid of any humanity, a smile revealing teeth stained with blood and a final understanding of his fate that was at once resignation and pure terror. Jacques Quartier, striving to maintain medical composure, even in the face of that indescribable scene, checked the royal pulse and found a heartbeat so irregular it seemed impossible that it continued at all. Louis XV's breathing had become a series of violent spasms, each inhale sounding like a Herculean effort to keep his soul tethered to his body for a few more moments. His skin had taken on a bluish tinge, starting from the extremities and spreading inward as though death itself were painting his body with its own ink. Most disturbing of all was that even in that state of extreme agony, his eyes continued rolling frenetically, as if seeing things the others present could not perceive. Pierre Doriol, the servant who had remained loyal to the king even in his darkest moments, later recounted that Louis XV spent his final minutes murmuring whispered conversations to invisible interlocutors. "He spoke as though he were in a crowded hall," Pierre said years later, negotiating, begging, sometimes shouting orders as though still King of France. But the most terrible part was when he stopped speaking and listened, turning his head as though someone was answering, and whatever he was hearing made him cry. Tears of pure terror streaming down his cheeks like drops of blood. The servant also described how the king, in his final moments, began making hand gestures, as though trying to ward off something or someone approaching his makeshift bed on the floor. Louis XVIII's final death occurred at the moment the rising sun began filtering through his chamber's windows, creating a grotesque contrast between the golden morning light and the utter darkness that had consumed his soul. His last breath was preceded by a scream the three witnesses described as the sound of 1,000 souls being dragged into hell simultaneously. His body arched violently, as if some invisible force were yanking him upward, remained suspended in that impossible position for several seconds, then collapsed with a dull thud that echoed through the room like a hammer striking a tombstone. His eyes, which had rolled frenetically until that moment, finally fixed on a specific point of the ceiling, a look of recognition and absolute terror etched in his dilated pupils forever. Jacques Quartier, examining the body immediately after death, recorded findings that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The king's hands were covered in self-inflicted scratches so deep they had bled throughout the night, and fragments of his own skin were lodged under his fingernails, evidence that he had physically fought something or someone invisible during his last hours. Even more disturbing was that, despite being dead, the expression on his face still conveyed pure terror. His mouth slightly open, as if in mid-scream, and his eyes wide in a look of final realization of the true nature of his life's deeds. The physician noted that he had never seen a corpse that appeared still to be experiencing fear after all vital functions had ceased. The Franciscan friar, deeply traumatized by what he had witnessed, remained kneeling beside the body for hours, praying not only for the king's soul, but also for his own sanity. He later wrote that, even after Louis XV's death was confirmed, the atmosphere in the room felt charged with a malevolent presence that made the hair on his neck stand on end. It was as if death had not taken away everything that was in that man, the friar recorded in his memoirs years later. Something remained in the room, something that was neither alive nor truly dead, something that continued whispering accusations and laments, even after the body ceased to breathe. The friar also mentioned that, during his final prayers, for the deceased, he had the distinct sensation he was not alone with the corpse, but that other presences lingered in the room, presences that watched and waited. The preparation of the royal body for the funeral revealed further horrific aspects of Louis XV's death. The embalmers hired to preserve the corpse reported unusual difficulties in their work. The body seemed to resist normal conservation procedures. The skin continued changing color even after application of oils and preservative substances, taking on hues ranging from pale green to deep purple, as though some accelerated decomposition process had begun independent of the embalming efforts. More disturbing still was that during the embalming, the king's facial muscles occasionally contracted spontaneously, creating expressions that alternated between sardonic smiles and agonized grimaces, making the workers cross themselves and murmur protective prayers. Louis XV's funeral was a somber event that perfectly reflected the nature of his terrifying death. Few nobles attended, and those who did kept as far from the coffin as possible, as though they feared the curse that had consumed the king might be contagious. During the ceremony at Tours Cathedral, several priests later reported feeling an oppressive presence in the air, a sense that something evil watched the proceedings from high above the Gothic vaults. The incense, which normally created an atmosphere of sacred solemnity, seemed unable to mask an underlying stench of decay, emanating not just from the coffin, but from the entire nave, as though death itself had impregnated the ancient stones. Pierre Doriol, who had remained loyal to the king until his last moments, was one of the few who dared approach the coffin during the wake. He later reported that when he looked at Louis XV's embalmed face, he had the unsettling impression that the dead eyes followed him, maintaining the same expression of recognition and terror they had held at the moment of death. It was as if he still saw those terrible things that tormented him in his last days, Pierre recounted years later. as though death had not ended his suffering, but only the beginning of something far worse. The servant also mentioned that during his vigil by the coffin, he heard sounds from within, not the normal noises of a decomposing body, but something like muffled whispers, as though the king's corpse was still trying to communicate with the living. The crypt where Louis XV was buried soon became a site of inexplicable phenomena that persisted for decades after his death. The monks responsible for maintaining the Basilica of Notre-Dame of Cléry-Saint-André, where the king had chosen to be entombed, regularly reported disturbing occurrences near his tomb. During morning prayers, they often heard moans that seemed to emanate directly from the tombstone, sounds so anguished that several brothers petitioned for transfers to other monasteries. Even more unsettling were reports of apparitions, shadows, moving independently of any light source, and spectral figures walking through the crypt corridors during the darkest hours of the night, always converging on the site where the Spider King lay. The abbot overseeing the basilica, a devout man named Abbot William of Sens, kept meticulous records of these phenomena in parchments later sealed and stored in the church's most secret archives. In his notes, he described nights when the entire monastic community was awakened by screams echoing from the depths of the crypt, screams seemingly coming not from one voice, but from many, as if a chorus of tormented souls were being led by some invisible conductor. "These are not merely the laments of a dead man," Abbot William wrote. "They are a cacophony of accusations, supplications, and curses that appear to implicate not only the king, but all who perished by his will during his dark reign." Jacques Coitier, who survived his master by only 2 years, spent his final months obsessively recording every detail of the royal death he had witnessed. His writings, discovered decades later in his home in Tours, revealed a man utterly consumed by memories of that terrible night. "I had been a physician for over 30 years when I witnessed His Majesty's death," he wrote in increasingly shaky, irregular script, "and never in all my experience treating nobles, soldiers, peasants, and criminals had I seen a human being die of pure fear. Not fear of death, but fear of something waiting for him on the other side. Something he recognized, something he knew he deserved to face." The physician also recorded that after the king's death, he himself began experiencing recurring nightmares in which he saw Louis XV walking the corridors of Plessis-les-Tours, not as a ghost, but as a living presence carrying with him all the souls of those he had destroyed in life. The effects of Louis IX's horrific death extended far beyond the walls of the castle where it occurred. His son and successor, Charles VIII, then only 13 years old, developed a morbid terror of sleeping alone after learning of his father's death circumstances. Courtiers reported that the young king frequently woke up screaming in the night, claiming his father had appeared in his dreams to warn him of the consequences of absolute power. Anne of Beaujeu, Charles VIII's older sister and regent during his minority, decreed that all details of Louis XV's death be kept in the strictest secrecy, fearing that the truth might destabilize not only the succession, but the very institution of the French monarchy. She ordered the burning of all official medical records related to the king's final months, but she could not entirely eradicate the whispers that spread through the corridors of power. The psychological impact of Louis XV's death reverberated across the European aristocracy like a wave of terror transcending political borders. Ambassadors who had known the king in life returned to their home courts, carrying fragmented accounts of his final deterioration, stories that were embellished and distorted until they became urban legends, warning of the dangers of absolute power and systematic cruelty. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, one of Louis XV's principal political rivals, was said to have remarked upon hearing the news of the king's death, "If a man so astute and powerful died in such agony, what hope remains for any of us who dare to rule over other mortals?" This statement, recorded by chroniclers of the time, revealed how the Spider King's death had become a universal symbol of the mortal limits of human ambition. In the years following Louis XIV's demise, a series of sinister coincidences befell those who had been close to him in his final moments. Jacques Coetier died in 1485 under circumstances many deemed suspicious, found dead in his bed with the same expression of terror that had marked his royal master's face. Pierre Doriol disappeared mysteriously in 1486, leaving behind only a letter that read, "They have come for me as well." The king was not alone that night. There were others, and now they want all of us who bore witness. The Franciscan friar who had served as the king's confessor descended into madness, repeating constantly fragments of Louis XV's last words until he was confined to a lunatic asylum where he died whispering the names of people long dead. Louis XV's posthumous influence also manifested in dramatic changes to French monarchical policies and traditions. Charles VIII and his successors abandoned the extensive espionage network that had been the hallmark of Louis XV's government, as though they feared such a web of information might attract the same curse that had consumed the Spider King. Public executions, common during Louis XV's reign, became rare, solemn events conducted only in cases of confirmed treason and always preceded by long periods of prayer and reflection. It was as if the monarchy had instinctively developed an aversion to the methods that had characterized the late king's rule, in an unconscious attempt to avoid the terrible fate that had befallen him. Legends surrounding Louis XV's death transcended documented history to become part of French popular folklore. Peasants in the regions around Tours began reporting sightings of a solitary knight riding at night on moonless roads, always heading toward places where executions had been ordered by the king during his life. Initially dismissed by local clergy as ignorant superstition, these accounts grew so consistent and detailed that even ecclesiastical authorities took them seriously. The Phantom Knight was always described the same way, gaunt to the point of emaciation, wearing tattered royal garments, and emitting a sound neither quite a cry nor a laugh, but something that made listeners instinctively cross themselves. Decades after Louis XV's death, scholars and theologians began analyzing the circumstances of his final agony as a case study on the relationship between temporal power and divine justice. Universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna organized academic debates on whether the king's dreadful death constituted evidence of God's direct intervention in human history, or was simply the natural result of psychological excesses associated with exercising absolute power. St. Thomas More, writing decades later, used Louis XV's example as a cautionary tale about tyranny's perils, arguing, "Those who govern through fear eventually discover that fear is a master without limits, or mercy ultimately consuming even those who believed they controlled it." Modern medical analysis of the symptoms recorded by Jacques Coetier suggests that Louis XV may have suffered from a combination of neurological and psychiatric conditions that mutually exacerbated during his final months. The tremors, visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and cognitive decline point to possible cases of early-onset dementia, compounded by decades of extreme stress, and possibly heavy metal poisoning, common in the era's medicinal treatments. However, even a purely scientific analysis cannot fully explain the specific nature of his visions, particularly the fact that he seemed to recognize and interact with specific figures from his past in ways that astonished even his time's skeptical observers. Louis XV's ultimate legacy became a dark meditation on the nature of power and its final consequences for the human soul. His death was not merely the biological end of a man, but the culmination of a life devoted to manipulation, betrayal, and systematic cruelty that ultimately turned against its architect. The Spider King, who wove his web of power from threads of others' suffering, found in his final moments that he had become a prisoner of his own creation, unable to escape. The consequences of his deeds, even when death offered the promise of release. His final agony revealed a fundamental truth about the human condition, that no earthly power, however absolute it may seem, can protect a man from the repercussions of his moral choices. Thus, Louis XVIII's death remains not only a historical event, but an eternal symbol of human ambition's limits and the inevitability of justice, whether divine or simply the natural operation of the moral laws governing the universe. His reign, marked by political cunning and calculated cruelty, found its logical conclusion in a death that perfectly reflected his life's nature. Solitary, terrified, and consumed by the weight of countless acts of cruelty. The man who had lived without mercy died without peace, and his story stands as a permanent reminder that even kings and emperors are, in the end, mere mortals subject to the same moral laws that govern all humanity. In the end, Louis XVIII discovered that he had built not a kingdom, but a prison, and that the key to his liberation had been destroyed by his own hands decades before his death arrived to claim what was rightfully its own.